welcome to another episode of Tiny Nest. I'm Kiva.
And I'm Jake. This series is following our tiny house project from the early stages through to completion and beyond.
This is part one of our flooring installation. We were originally going to go with a vinyl flooring, but we ended up getting this laminate flooring for free from my parents when they were cleaning out a storage locker. And it just happens to be the exact amount that we need for the tiny house, so you can't beat free. Thanks, Mom and Dad.
We're getting ready to put down the flooring, and we're going to give the whole floor a quick sanding to sort of clean it up a bit. So the first thing I'm doing is going and checking all the screws to make sure that they're sunken down below the surface, that there's no heads poking up that we're going to catch the sanding pads on, and also so there's no like little raised points anywhere on the floor. So for example here I can catch my fingernail on the edge of this screw. So I'm just doing this by hand to have more control and just tightening it down a couple turns until it's recessed below. And it's also kind of nice to go around like this because we put these screws in well over a year ago. So giving them all a little extra twist before we cover them all up is just going to mean that all the plywood is nice and secure. Because of course it may have expanded or contracted and shifted a little bit since we installed it, so going back over it after it's kind of settled is definitely not a bad thing. We will be checking the whole floor a bit more carefully because you're never supposed to have more than 1/8 of an inch of difference in height over a 10-foot span in any direction for laminate flooring, which is the type of flooring we're putting down. And so, but right here you can see, for example, that there is a difference in height. Like this piece of plywood is slightly higher than this one. It's way less than 1/8 of an inch, but it is kind of a harsh step. So one of the things we're trying to achieve with the sanding is to at least clean up some of the more noticeable sort of edges and rough spots so that at least things are kind of smooth, you know, from piece to piece.
And now that the screws are all down, I'm going to go ahead and sand the floor with a coarse paper. Because we don't have any extra flooring, we're not going to put any down underneath our kitchen cabinets. So we just screwed down some scrap pieces of wood to sort of make a rough outline of where our cabinets are going to be. And then when we put the floor down, we'll have something to butt up against. After sanding, we vacuumed the floor to make sure that it was clean and there wasn't any chunks of debris. And then after that, we checked it for flatness by pulling a string and seeing if there was any dips. And we did find that this part right here was a lot higher than the other parts, so we gave it an extra sanding, but it is still a bit high, so we'll keep that in mind when we install the floor. Now that the subfloor is ready to go, we need to put down an underlayment to go underneath our laminate flooring. And most products out there have a vapor barrier built into them, but if you remember when we installed our subfloor, we have a vapor barrier right underneath the plywood, so we didn't want to put another vapor barrier on top of the plywood because this would sandwich the plywood between two barriers. And we want one barrier with the layers of material either inside or outside the vapor barrier. Luckily, we found this Cork option. We hadn't considered it before, but when we held it up to the light, we could see that light was coming through it, which meant that it was breathable. So we went with this one because it was the only breathable underlayment that we could find. The Cork comes in these funny little 2 by 3 foot pieces, but they're really easy to work with, and we're just putting them down on the ground and stapling them in, and then going around with a hammer and making sure all the staples are down nice and tight. And if we need to cut it, it's really easy to cut with just an X-Acto knife. One weird thing that happened with the Cork is when we got them, they all were nice and flat, but after storing them in the tiny house, they got a bit wavy. But I think it's going to be okay because if we sort of like flatten out the waves, they all line up, so I don't think it's going to make any sort of bumps underneath the laminate.
So we mentioned that this spot was a bit high, like the plywood was high. And so at first we covered it completely with the cork and tried sanding some of the cork off to try to compensate for that, but that didn't really work very well. So then we tested cutting out a bit of a strip and then used a level to check, because it was rocking quite a bit on the high spot, and we checked how it was with and without the strip, and removing some cork in the middle definitely improved how much rocking there is. So it's quite a bit better. In some spots it's actually pretty good. Right about here is probably the worst. There's a fair bit of rocking, but it's definitely better, we think, to have a bit of a compensation for that high spot. And the pieces of flooring are quite a bit more flexy than like a level. And even on sort of a spot, probably the worst spot along here, it's clear that it's gonna sit down fine. It's not gonna rock or anything. And the other thing to think about here is that it's basically totally flat here, and then right on this sort of axis, it drops a bit and then sort of carries on. So it's not like there's a bunch of high spots that's gonna, or like a dip somewhere. It's the flooring, it just needs to basically go like this and then tilt a little bit. And we're hoping that the flex in the material will be able to make up for that, and that it won't be too much of a problem. But the one thing that I am gonna do here is, we figured that if the cork ever compresses to a point where when we step over this spot, the laminate is like a hair away from the wood, and then we can get that kind of thing where the bottom of the laminate kind of smacks the plywood. So to deal with that, I'm just gonna put some masking tape down onto the wood, like a couple layers, because this is obviously super thin, but it is a bit soft. So that should deaden the blow of wood on wood. There'll be something in between to soften that. I mean, it's still, but it's less, I think. Is it not? Right. All right, we got the first couple rows down, and it seems to be going pretty good. We're just using little niblets of our wall panel material as shims to keep the flooring, maintain a gap between the flooring and the walls. That's for like expansion and shifting and stuff. And one of the things that we did, that we looked at really carefully before we started, was where these seams of the flooring are going to end up. So we checked, we checked where the edges of the rooms are, the inner bathrooms, and then the fender and the wall and the kitchen cabinets, and checked them all to make sure that there wouldn't be a spot where we'd end up very close to a wall but too far, like too big of a gap for trim to cover, which would mean we'd have to fill it in with like a super thin strip, which would be really awkward and probably wouldn't work very well. So it required that we start with a slightly sliced piece. So this is all in metric, so they're 9 centimeters wide, and we cut the first row down to 7 centimeters to place that first seam, so that as we go down, the seams will land nicely and make it easier, for the future tasks here. So I'll point it out more when we get there, but for now we're lined up in a way that's going to work well. All right, it's going pretty good. We've got a feel for sort of how to put it together, and everything seems to be going together nice and tight. And we're making sure to stagger these seams from row to row. So like one seam there, one up there, here, so on. But also we're trying to minimize wastage, so each row we're kind of looking at the scraps we have and seeing if we can kind of mix and match. But I'll do a quick demonstration of just how it fits together here. I've got a bunch of pieces cut for the next couple spots, and just as a super quick example of how it goes in, basically line this seam up and then kind of wedge it in an angle and keep pressure on it as it drops down. So basically just like that. And then I'll show you more closely on this next one. So you can pretty much just see what's happening here. This has got like an overlapping top bit, and this has got a bottom bit that sticks out to accept that. And there's like grooves and raised ridges here that will lock it in place. And the one extra thing is that this edge, where I'm running my finger along, is raised, and then there's a divot under here. So the only thing is that I've got to get that underneath that, and that's why I put it in an angle. So basically, just get it sort of like this. And then I just want to make sure that this is kind of lined up pretty good. And then put pressure in, make sure that's underneath, and then just drop it down. And if this is pretty tight, that's okay, because the next piece will basically lock that. As long as it's not actually overlapping, and as long as there's no gap here, it should be pretty good. That's it for part 1, so tune in next time for the exciting conclusion to the flooring installation.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you like what we're doing here, and turn on email notifications so you never miss a video. You can also find extra resources in the description below.
We spend countless hours making these videos for YouTube, so if you appreciate our work, take 3 minutes to watch the video in the top left tile to learn some ways that you can support us for free.
We'd really appreciate it.